It is the morning of September 17th, 1944. The skies over southern England are the clearest they have been in weeks, and from aerodromes stretching across Oxfordshire, Lincolnshire, and the flat reaches of East Anglia, the most audacious airborne operation in the history of warfare is beginning to take shape. On the tarmac at RAF Harwell, paratroopers of the 1st British Airborne Division check their equipment with the quiet efficiency of men who have rehearsed this moment so many times that the motion has become almost instinctual. They are, most of them, veterans. They have waited for this. They have waited far too long. The aircraft, Sterlings, Halifaxes, Dakotas, sit loaded and trembling on the runways. Gliders, hundreds of them, are hitched to their tow planes in long, patient lines. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a young officer named Roy Urquhart, commander of the 1st Airborne, looks out across the marshalling chaos and allows himself a moment of quiet calculation. In 72 hours, if everything goes to plan, his men will hold the last bridge over the Rhine. The great river that has guarded the heart of Germany since Roman times will be crossed. The road to Berlin will be open. The war, which has already consumed 5 years and tens of millions of lives, could be over by Christmas. Operation Market Garden was conceived by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, arguably the most controversial commander the British Army has ever produced. It was bold in a way that Montgomery's critics insisted he was incapable of being. It was, in truth, the kind of plan that makes military historians argue across decades about whether it was the work of a genius or a gambler, and the uncomfortable answer is that it was, perhaps, both at once. The plan was elegantly simple in outline, monstrously complex in execution. 3.5 Allied airborne divisions would drop from the sky in a corridor stretching 64 miles through the Netherlands. They would seize 9 bridges over canals and rivers in sequence, like stepping stones across a swamp. Ground forces, the tanks and lorries and infantry of XXX Corps, would then drive up a single road, crossing each bridge in turn, and reach the final prize, the great road bridge at Arnhem over the Lower Rhine. Once across, the Allies would be around the northern flank of Germany's Siegfried line. The Wehrmacht, already reeling from the catastrophic losses of the summer, would have no prepared defensive positions to fall back on. The war in the West might end not in the spring of 1945, but before the year was out. What followed was one of the most dramatic, agonizing, and instructive failures in the history of military planning, and understanding why it failed, understanding how close it came to succeeding, tells us something profound about the nature of the war itself, and about the gap between brilliant conception and brutal reality. To understand why Market Garden was proposed at all, it is necessary to understand the extraordinary and dangerously intoxicating situation that faced the Allied High Command in the late summer of 1944. The liberation of France had proceeded at a pace that surprised even the most optimistic planners. Paris had fallen on August 25th. The German Army Group B was in catastrophic retreat, streaming eastward in a state of what many Allied commanders genuinely believed approached total collapse. General Eisenhower's intelligence staff estimated that the Wehrmacht had lost, in the Normandy campaign alone, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The euphoria was dangerous, and it was real. Senior officers who had spent 4 years fighting a war of grinding attrition began to speak, cautiously at first and then with gathering confidence about a single decisive stroke that might end everything. Supply lines were the limiting factor. The Allies had outrun their logistics, and without fuel, even the most powerful armored spearhead grinds to a halt. This was the central argument against Market Garden from the beginning, pressed most forcefully by the American General Omar Bradley and by Eisenhower himself, who preferred a broad front strategy that would advance across the whole theater simultaneously, stretching German resources to breaking point. Montgomery dismissed this approach with a contempt he rarely bothered to conceal. The broad front, he argued, would allow the Germans time to reconstitute their shattered forces, to man the Siegfried line, to dig in and wait out the winter. It would transform the war from a campaign of movement back into the attritional nightmare of the previous 4 years. What was needed instead was a concentrated thrust. A single, powerful, well-supplied, armored fist aimed directly at the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of the Reich. 40 divisions, given priority of supply over everything else, could be through Germany and standing before Berlin before the leaves fell from the trees. The argument was not without merit. German forces defending the Netherlands in early September 1944 were, by any honest assessment, in a desperate condition. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was sending messages to Berlin that read more like eulogies than operational reports. On September 4th, Dutch civilians reported seeing German soldiers fleeing in such disorder that they were abandoning vehicles, weapons, and uniforms. This day entered Dutch national memory as Dolle Dinsdag, Mad Tuesday. So chaotic was the apparent disintegration of the occupying forces. Had the Allies pushed hard through the Netherlands in those first days of September, the outcome might have been very different. But supply shortages, the need to consolidate gains, and the fundamental logistics of moving an army stopped them short. It was into this window of apparent German weakness that Montgomery inserted the plan that would become Market Garden. The Germans, he argued, had not the strength to resist a coup de main of sufficient boldness. He was, as subsequent events made searingly clear, both right and tragically wrong. The architectural genius of Market Garden and the source of much of its ultimate failure lay in its dependence on the concept of vertical envelopment, using airborne forces to seize objectives so far behind enemy lines that the enemy could not react in time. The man tasked with making this concept work was Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of the British Airborne Corps, a man of formidable elegance and genuine ability who has, perhaps unfairly, been made to carry a disproportionate share of the blame for what followed. Browning's corps would deliver 3 divisions from the sky in a single day. The American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, would drop nearest to the Allied front lines, in the zone between Eindhoven and Wegel, seizing the bridges over the Dommel and Aa rivers and the Wilhelmina Canal. Further north, the American 82nd Airborne Division would take the great road bridge at Nijmegen over the Well River and the crucial Groesbeek Heights that dominated the surrounding terrain. And at the furthest end of the corridor, 64 miles behind the front, the British 1st Airborne Division would descend upon Arnhem and seize the bridge over the Lower Rhine. The timing was brutal in its logic. XXX Corps, under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, one of the finest operational commanders in the British Army, would begin its ground advance the moment the airborne troops touched down. It was calculated that they could cover the 64 miles in 48 hours. The airborne troops at Arnhem, the plan assumed, needed only to hold the bridge for 2 days. What the plan required, above all else, was intelligence. And it is here, in the gap between what was known and what was assumed, that the seeds of catastrophe were quietly planted. The intelligence picture for the Arnhem area was not empty. It was, in certain crucial respects, damningly full. Dutch resistance sources had been warning for days that German armored forces were resting and refitting in the woods around Arnhem. A report reached the headquarters of the 1st Airborne Division shortly before the operation launched, accompanied by aerial reconnaissance photographs suggesting that elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, specifically the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, were present in the Arnhem area. These were not broken formations scratching for their lives in retreat. These were veteran, battle-hardened units of the Waffen-SS, even if they had suffered substantial losses in Normandy. And they were there, in precisely the zone where the 1st Airborne was about to land. The report was brought to Browning's attention. He had it assessed by his intelligence staff. The photographs were examined, and then, with a decision that has echoed through military history ever since, it was determined that the intelligence could not be considered reliable enough to alter the plan. the officer who pressed most forcefully for the information to be taken seriously. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence chief at Airborne Corps Headquarters, no relation to the divisional commander, was told with a disturbing gentleness that he appeared to be suffering from nervous strain and advised to take medical leave. He was removed from the planning process entirely. If you are finding this account compelling, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might imagine. The drop zones for the 1st Airborne at Arnhem were a problem that was understood and accepted rather than solved. Good drop zones, flat, open, defensible, existed close to the Arnhem Bridge, but they were rejected because of concerns about anti-aircraft defenses near the river crossing. Instead, the 1st Airborne would land on heathland and polders 8 kilometers to the west of the bridge. In the planning documents, this was treated as a manageable constraint. On the ground, it meant that the lightly armed paratroopers would have to march through 8 kilometers of Dutch suburbia and woodland to reach their objective, giving any German forces in the area ample time to react. The plan also assumed that the full division could not be delivered in a single lift. Aircraft were insufficient in number. This meant that on the first day, only roughly a third of the division's fighting strength would land near Arnhem. The remainder would arrive on subsequent days during which the Germans would have every opportunity to reinforce, to organize, and to seal off the bridge. The operation began, in its opening moments, with a success that felt miraculous. At 13:00 hours on September 17, 1944, the sky above southern Holland filled with aircraft and gliders in numbers that left Dutch civilians below standing in their gardens and fields, weeping with something that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. The drops were, by the standards of earlier airborne operations, remarkably accurate. The 101st and 82nd secured most of their objectives swiftly. The ground advance of XXX Corps began with a thunderous artillery barrage and a charge by the Irish Guards Armoured Regiment up the main road from the Belgian border. At Arnhem, a battalion of the 1st Parachute Brigade, 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, broke away from the main body and moved through Arnhem itself with aggressive speed, pressing forward along a route that kept them off the main roads and out of the worst of the growing German resistance. In the fading light of September 17th, Frost's roughly 700 men reached the northern ramp of the Arnhem Road Bridge and seized it. They dug in. They radioed their position. They waited for the rest of the division to fight through and join them. The rest of the division never came. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, precisely as the dismissed intelligence had warned, were there. They were reorganizing. They had a commander of rare ability in Brigade Führer Wilhelm Bietrich, who grasped the situation with remarkable speed and threw his forces into the gap between Frost's isolated battalion and the rest of the 1st Airborne with a violence that effectively sealed the fate of the operation within its first 12 hours. What followed at Arnhem over the next 9 days has become one of the defining stories of British military history. Frost's men, outnumbered, under sustained artillery fire, running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, held the northern end of the bridge for 4 days. 4 days. They held it against armored vehicles with grenades and anti-tank rifles. They held it while the houses around them burned, and the rooms they fought from shrank floor by floor as the fire consumed the buildings above them. They held it after Frost himself was wounded. They held it until there was quite literally nothing left with which to hold it. The ground advance of XXX Corps had meanwhile stalled. The single road, derisively nicknamed Hell's Highway by the American paratroopers defending it, was cut repeatedly by German counterattacks. The tanks could not travel cross-country through the Dutch polderland. The road was their only route, and it was narrow, raised above the surrounding flat country, and murderously exposed. Each delay at a bridge, each ambush along the highway, each hour lost to traffic and confusion, and the sheer logistical reality of moving a corps along a single carriageway, translated directly into mounting casualties for the men holding on at Arnhem. By September 21st, it was clear that XXX Corps would not reach the Arnhem Bridge in time. Frost's remaining men were overrun. The survivors, some 300 out of the original 700 Duark, were taken prisoner. Further west, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division fought on in a steadily shrinking perimeter centered on the suburb of Oosterbeek, supplied by airdrops in which much of the cargo fell into German hands due to damaged radios that made it impossible for the men on the ground to correct the delivery coordinates. On the night of 25th to 26th September, 9 days after the operation began, what remained of the 1st Airborne Division was withdrawn across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the nearly 10,600 men who had gone in, approximately 1,400 were killed, 6,400 taken prisoner, and a further 3,500 wounded. Around 2,400 crossed back to Allied lines. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The failures of Market Garden were both operational and conceptual, and military analysts have spent 8 decades arguing about which category of failure was more decisive. The American official history, written with the cool distance that comes from institutional separation, was relatively direct. The plan had demanded too much of airborne forces operating without adequate ground support, too far from their own lines for too long. The single-road axis of advance for XXX Corps had been not a calculated risk but a structural flaw, a motorway to catastrophe with no alternative routes when the predictable ambushes came. The Germans themselves drew sharp lessons from Arnhem. Field Marshal Model, who had been nearly captured by the 1st Airborne's landing zone on the operation's first morning, he had been eating lunch in Arnhem when the planes appeared overhead. Called the defeat of Market Garden, the turning point that gave Germany the winter it needed to rebuild its western defenses. The Siegfried line was manned. Fresh divisions were formed from rear area troops and recovering wounded. The counteroffensive in the Ardennes, launched that December in what history knows as the Battle of the Bulge, was made possible in significant part by the time bought at Arnhem. The contrast with American airborne operations in the same corridor is instructive. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions achieved most of their objectives because they operated closer to the front lines, with shorter exposure before ground forces arrived, and in terrain that offered more options for the advancing XXX Corps. At Arnhem, the distance was simply too great, the duration too long, the margin for error too thin. Any single element of the intelligence that was dismissed, the presence of the SS Panzer Corps, the inadequate drop zones, the single-road axis, the insufficient first lift strength, might in isolation have been managed. Together, they compounded into something unretrievable. General Eisenhower later wrote that Market Garden had been 90% successful, a remark that has struck many as either diplomatic generosity or a fundamental misunderstanding of what the remaining 10% cost. The Nijmegen Bridge was taken in a remarkable assault by the 82nd Airborne, crossing the wall in flimsy canvas boats under fire in broad daylight, an act of collective courage that observers described as the most extraordinary thing they had ever seen. The southern bridges were held, but without Arnhem, the corridor led nowhere that mattered. What is most striking about Market Garden, viewed across the distance of 80 years, is not the failure, but the closeness of the success. The margin between what happened and what might have happened is measured in hours and kilometers. Had the 1st Airborne been permitted to land closer to the bridge, dismissing the anti-aircraft concerns that proved, in practice, to be overstated, Frost's men might have arrived in such strength that the bridge could not have been sealed off. Had the intelligence about the SS Panzer Corps been acted upon, even with a delay of 48 hours while different drop zones were selected and a heavier first lift was arranged, the shape of German resistance at Arnhem would have been fundamentally different. Had XXX Corps been able to advance even 12 hours faster, had the traffic on Hell's Highway flowed more smoothly, had the German ambushes been anticipated and countered, had the tanks reached Nijmegen a day earlier, the Arnhem Bridge might still have been in British hands when they crossed the Waal. Had the radios worked, or had the emergency frequencies been properly synchronized, The air supply drops might have sustained the garrison through the 5th day, the 6th, the 7th. At any of a dozen decision points, the outcome could have been different. This is, of course, the nature of military history. Campaigns are not decided by plans, but by the collision of plans with reality, and reality has a habit of introducing variables that no staff officer anticipated. The intelligence was there. The warning was given. The uncomfortable truth of Market Garden is not that the plan was impossible, but that it was made impossible by the refusal to accept what was already known. The men of the 1st Airborne Division, reduced to fighting with whatever could be found in the ruins of Oosterbeek, dropping their rifles to pick up German weapons when their own ran dry, sharing single magazines between 2 men, surviving on whatever the Dutch civilian population could conceal and pass through the lines, are remembered in the Netherlands with a fidelity that has not diminished in 8 decades. Every September, on the anniversary of the operation, Dutch families place flowers on the graves at the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery, where 1,759 of the men who fought there lie buried. Children are taught what the British paratroopers attempted and what it cost them. The relationship between the Dutch and those who tried to liberate them endures as one of the most quietly moving chapters in the history of the Allied war in the West. The bridge at Arnhem still stands. Not the original that was destroyed in the fighting of April 1945, when the Allies finally crossed the Rhine in force, months later than Market Garden had promised. The current bridge, built in the 1970s, was named the John Frost Bridge in 1978, in honor of the officer who held the northern end for 4 impossible days. If you stand on it today and look west along the Lower Rhine, you can see the flat, green Dutch landscape stretching away to the horizon, unchanged in its essential character from what Frost's men saw through the smoke in September 1944. The operation that was meant to end the war by Christmas instead extended it by months. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the bitterest of the century, and Allied troops spent it in foxholes and cellars across the Netherlands and Belgium, cold and dug in, while the German army used the time that Arnhem had bought them to prepare the Ardennes offensive that would kill tens of thousands more men on both sides before it was finally stopped. The war in Europe did not end until May 8, 1945, 8 months after the paratroopers of the 1st Airborne descended through the clear September sky above the Dutch countryside. The intelligence was real. The warning was given. The plan was bold enough and the men were brave enough, and the window existed, however briefly, however narrowly, in which it might have worked. Market Garden remains the most painful kind of historical case. Not a story of incompetence, but of a competence that was almost enough. Almost, and then not quite. The bridge was a bridge too far, and the war lasted exactly as long as that distance demanded.